Hello everybody. In this video, I wanted to show you an architectural pattern around event-driven API implementation. Now, this is an existing feature that's already been released, so you're welcome to use this in production today. With this pattern, what we're doing is we're using the webhook handler to capture an HTTP request, which is really what an API call is. It's just that people kind of tend to think of webhooks as from their perspective, meaning that there's things that they send to others, but those others having to receive those webhooks and process them, those are basically just regular APIs. So what we're really doing is we're just using the webhook handler to implement a service. And the only thing that makes it special is that this service actually returns data back, which is maybe a little bit different than people are used to thinking of webhooks as. They tend to think of webhooks as just a kind of acknowledging the receipt. However, nothing prevents a webhook HTTP call from returning data. So maybe a little bit not how you're used to thinking about webhooks, but you'll see it in action here, and I think it'll make a lot of sense. So the purpose of that webhook handler is to expose a new endpoint on Poly. That's going to give us a URL that's going to be listening for events, and that URL is going to have a certain structure, and I'll show you that in just a second. And what's going to happen is that webhook handler raises an event. At that point, any subscriber to that event has the right to basically implement it. That webhook event is going to go through a set of security functions. And those security functions are there to make sure that the message has been checked and processed before it's acted upon. So you can think of those as kind of like gateway policies in a traditional API gateway, or as authorizer functions in AWS Lambda. And so once the event has passed through those security functions, then it gets routed to one of two places. It's either going to get routed to a server function if you've configured a trigger, or it can be routed down to your client. I'm going to show the implementation using my client, which is actually going to be running on my laptop. However, once I'm ready to deploy this, I can either deploy this application as a whole, or I can actually deploy it as a Poly server function and register a trigger to trigger it. So I have a lot of choice there. And the real value here, which I'll show you today, is that you can build and test microservices and APIs extremely quickly. This is something that I believe is going to speed up drastically the time it takes to build a new service or API. And I hope that it actually builds comfort in creating new APIs that are maybe single purpose or partner specific, and unlocks a lot of innovation in the industry. The big innovation here that makes this possible is the event-driven approach to API implementations using WebSockets. And what Poly does is it just simplifies that down to a function. So I'll show you the function, I'll explain what's happening behind the scenes, and hopefully you'll see how the event-driven architecture is actually a lot of simplification if you encapsulate it correctly in a simple user experience. And the last part is I do want to just share a little bit about the vision. You'll see that there's kind of opportunities to improve this, to really productize it more comprehensively. One is going to be to extend this to other event sources. So not only webhooks, but maybe Kafka events, maybe GraphQL subscription events. There's going to be other ways that people send you these requests to your APIs. And so what we ideally want to do is be able to natively handle different protocols and be able to build APIs to serve those specific protocols directly. Additionally, you'll see that the security functions is something I set as the developer, which is generally not a great practice. So we do have some room in Poly to make it so that the security functions can kind of just be by default added to APIs, maybe based on a classification. And so that way my API will be protected correctly. It could potentially also be driven based on some state. So maybe I decide I want to publish my API publicly. A different set of security functions is applied than if I'm just publishing it internally. So definitely some room for improvement there around the governance. And then lastly, the Ingress resource organization. So you'll see that I basically just get a generated endpoint for where my webhook lives. I'll have control of the path. However, if you think of yourself creating lots of different APIs, you want to be able to structure those into a hierarchy to make a nice resource model at your HTTP endpoints to make your APIs intuitive to kind of maneuver through, discover, and consume. So definitely an opportunity there to create new capability to help you kind of assemble these many APIs into a graph or resource tree structure. So with that, let's jump into the demo. So here we are in Postman, and we're going to go ahead and register that webhook. So to register the webhook, you basically give it a name and a context, which I've covered in previous videos. It's just how you classify and organize your functions within Poly. And then you specify the event payload, which is the payload, the body that it's going to be receiving. In this case here, we're just expecting a JSON that has a question attribute with a question inside it. You specify a subpath of where this resource can be found as kind of an endpoint URL that you want it to be listening at. And then you specify the method you want to invoke it. And here we can also specify a set of security functions. So I mentioned these before. Normally you shouldn't be doing this as a developer in a production use case. So these registrations would be something that would be administratively or programmatically set up in production. And then in the future, we'd love to also be able to make it so that the developer maybe registering the webhook doesn't even care about it. These security functions, like I mentioned, are administratively driven or environment based. So there's a lot of opportunities to kind of improve the implicit governance story here. But nonetheless, these security functions have to be processed. And in my case here, I just have an authorization function, which is looking for a header that needs to be named foo, and that header needs to have a value of bar. So just a representative authorization function. You have the ability to implement whatever logic you want in a single or multiple set of these security functions. So let's go ahead and register this webhook. And we can see that it's been successfully created. This webhook here is basically, going to be listening at this URL, which is the same URL that we would use to look at the details of the webhook. But it's also going to be listening at the subpath of questions, and it's going to expect a post. So that's going to be our webhook. And you can see it's modeled out the event payload type schema in JSON schema, and it's basically the same representation where you have a property named question of type string that is required. So with that, let's go to VS Code and see how we would actually implement a simple version of this function. So here we are in VS Code. I'll go ahead and just do npx poly generate to get me the latest library, and then we should see our new webhook function show up in the tree. And so we can see that API questions on post has been added. I can go ahead and paste it in, and this gives me kind of the basic webhook handling syntax. Of course, I need to import poly, so let's do that real quick. Okay, and then in here, I could log all three of these, so I'll just go ahead and do that as a simple example. And at this point, I'm actually going to be a subscriber to a webhook event, but I won't be telling the server to wait for my reply. We'll layer that in to kind of show you the difference between the kind of base webhook pattern and then this API, event-driven API pattern. So to fire this up, I'll just do ts node, my API. And at this point, what happens is Poly's client behind the scenes, by virtue of using this function, opens up a WebSocket connection to the Poly server, and that's going to be the delivery mechanism between the server, which is acting kind of as the gateway that has those authorization service functions that need to be processed, and then my client, which is acting as the implementation of this service. So that WebSocket connection is the delivery mechanism that allows us to communicate, but since I didn't tell it to wait for a response, it's going to be a one-way communication channel so far. So let's go ahead and fire off that webhook and see an event show up here. So to fire off the webhook, we would basically use the ID that was generated at the time of creation and then do a get on it. And then here you can see the full URL. You can also construct this URL. It's basically just the base URL that you would create webhooks at, plus its ID, plus its subpath. in this case questions. So I'll just go ahead and do /questions. And then for the body, I'm going to go ahead and just have a question. And my question is going to be how many days in a year? And we do need to make it a post because we registered to be a post. And so at this point, because we didn't register a specific response status code or anything, we should just kind of get the base behavior from Poly. But we will also need to supply that header foo equals bar, otherwise the security function will complain. So I'll go ahead and just trigger it without the header so we could see it fail intentionally. So we could see that we got rejected with a 403. In my security function, I didn't implement the custom message, so it just shows up as null. You have full control over that as well, just something I haven't done for this demo, but it's failing because we don't have the appropriate authorization header. And if we were to look in VS Code, no event was delivered. So let's go ahead and add an extra header and do it again. And this time we just got the acknowledgement that everything's okay. Again, you have full control over this message if you want it to be just the standard webhook pattern, but we didn't get a response. And that's intentional. So let's go to VS Code, see the event, and then let's go ahead and implement the response. So here we are in VS Code. We can see we've got first the event, which is the payload that's been delivered to us. We also have the headers. We can see foo bars there. And then we also have the params. In this case, we don't have any query params or template parameters specified. You can also pull information from the actual template params or query params if you'd like. But in this case, it's just null, so it's an empty object. So great, we've tested the mechanism of delivery is working, just as expected. Now let's go ahead and implement a response. So I'm going to go ahead and do something like return. There are 365 or 366 days in a year. Oops. We'll go ahead and do something like this. And so at this point, we're telling it, hey, we'll go ahead and give you this string back. There is a little bit of work that we would want to do if we really wanted to make this modeled out correctly so that the other users could use this particular logic. We would probably want to make it a separate server function with a trigger. But at this point, I'm just kind of in development mode, in prototyping mode, and so I'm not too concerned about kind of modeling it out correctly so that we have it represented in the catalog with type definitions, etc. So I'm just going to go ahead and keep it kind of super rough here in this example. But the big thing we'll do is we'll add a second argument here, which is wait for response that defaults to false if you don't specify it. So we'll do wait for response, and we'll set that to true. Oops, and I think it needs to be modeled as an object. Cool, so these are kind of like additional configs that we're giving the server. So this time around, when I start it, it's actually gonna behave the same way, set up the WebSocket connection, except this time we've told the Poly server to wait for a response before releasing the connection to the caller. And so in this case, we should actually see our return message make it into the API response. So let me go ahead and show you that. So here we are in Postman. So let's go ahead and fire it off again. You can see that we're just getting plain text here as our response. And so yeah, it's working end to end, and we would see the event log in VS Code as well. Now let's take it a level further. Let's make this an actual JSON response. Let's set the response header to be JSON, because right now it's just defaulting to text plain. And let's also control the status code. So although 200 is the appropriate status code, we'll just change it to something else to showcase the ability to control it. So let's go back to VS Code and we'll pick it up from there. So here we are in VS Code. We can see the event came through. I'm gonna go ahead and stop it there, and then let's go ahead and make a few modifications. So this is where another attribute which really should be copy pasted by default from the tree. So that's a little enhancement we'll make. But it's modeled out here. It's called poly custom. It's optional, and you get to specify a response status code and response content type. So we'll just go ahead and do poly custom, and then with that we can actually go ahead and do something like this. So we can do poly custom dot response content type equals, and we'll just do application JSON. And then we'll do poly custom response status code, and we'll set that to 200, and we'll just do it 202. Again, wrong status code just to show the point. And then the return statement will actually make it just a JSON. So we'll do something like this, answer, and then like that. And actually I don't need the quotes around it, so we'll do something like this for the return statement. So let's go ahead and fire it up again. And let's go back to Postman and try. Okay, let's fire it off. And we can see that this time we have an answer structure, and we can see that in the headers we are getting a application JSON content type, and then the status code is a 202. So at this point I'm going to go ahead and cut it here. But really what you would do is you would implement the remainder. You would come in here and basically write your logic, probably abstract it as a server function, deploy it to the Poly server, unless you want to actually deploy this as its own standalone Node.js application, in which case you're welcome to run this wherever you'd like. And then the same pattern with Python, same pattern with Java. You have a choice of either hosting it as a Poly server function and then having it be invoked via a trigger, or you have the ability to kind of write these functions into your code and have your client receive the events. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Hopefully this showcases how easy it can be to build APIs using Poly, and how much help this one particular function is in being able to bridge that connection between yourself and the server to be able to be that implementation layer for the microservices. So thank you very much. Have a great day, and I appreciate